Welcome, friend. Tonight, we explore the long, uncertain voyage of English prisoners bound for Australia to build new lives. Now is the time to settle in. Find that perfect spot in your bed where everything feels just right. Allow your shoulders to soften and your breathing to slow down, matching the gentle rhythm of our story. There is nothing else you need to do. Where are you tuning in from this evening? And what time does your clock show? Is it the dead of night? Or are you perhaps sneaking this in before your wonderfully chaotic day begins? It matters little, as you are most welcome here. If you find a sense of peace in these tales, a quiet follow or subscribe ensures we can always find each other again. Now, let your mind drift. You are a young man, your hands skilled with a draftsman's pen, your spirit eager for a life beyond the city's grimy confines. But a single, misguided act has sealed your fate. You now stand on the creaking deck of a ship, the only world you have ever known shrinking to a gray line behind you. The journey to New South Wales has begun. The darkness was not empty. It was a solid thing, made of the shoulders, backs, and knees of other men, all pressed together in the belly of this groaning beast. I learned to sleep sitting up, my spine pressed against the rough, curved timbers of the hull, feeling every shudder of the waves through the wood. The constant motion was a miserable companion, a ceaseless rocking that worked its way into my bones until I felt unsteady even when lying still. Back in my London workshop, my world had been one of straight lines, of precise right angles, and the clean, satisfying scrape of a graphite pencil on fine paper. Here, there were no straight lines, only the forced curve of the ship's ribs and the slumped, defeated shapes of my fellow prisoners. This new reality carried its own unique perfume, a harsh, acidic scent that rose from the bilge water sloshing somewhere below us. The bilge, as the sailors called it, was the ship's lowest point, where all the filth and leakage collected, and its odor was a constant presence. It was a smell so sharp it made my eyes water and left a sour taste at the back of my throat with every breath. To escape it, I would press my face into the thin wool of my sleeve, but the fabric was already saturated with the same foulness. I thought of the scent of my old workshop, of drying ink, fresh wood shavings, and the faint, sweet smell of the tea my sister would bring me. That memory felt like a story from another man's life. The sound was the worst of it. It was a language of misery spoken by the ship itself. A deep, resonant groan came from the main timbers as they twisted under the ocean's power, a sound that seemed to come from the center of the earth. This was accompanied by the high-pitched shriek of rope straining against wood, and the constant, dull slap of water against the hull. The noises were so relentless that silence became a forgotten luxury. Sometimes, to block out the harsh mix of sounds, I would close my eyes and retreat into the one place they could not chain, my mind. There, I could construct perfect, silent things. In that internal space, I would begin to draw. I pictured a clean, white surface and imagined the satisfying feel of a charcoal stick in my fingers. I would start with a simple line, then another, forming a perfect square. from that square, I would pull lines of perspective, creating a cube that I could turn and examine from all angles. I built imaginary cathedrals, their arches soaring into a darkness of my own design, and drew complex geometric patterns that spiraled inward, demanding all my concentration. It was the only order I could find in this chaotic, moving prison. This mental exercise was more than a distraction. It was a lifeline, a way to keep the part of me that was a draftsman from being completely erased.
My conviction felt like a cruel joke. I had not robbed a man or set fire to a building. I had printed pamphlets. They were filled with words arguing that a man's worth ought not be measured by the title he inherits, but by the skill of his hands and the thoughts in his head. For arranging words and ink on paper, for doing my job with a little too much principle, I was branded a criminal and sent to the far side of the world. A judge in a powdered wig, who had never known a day of honest labor, had condemned me to this. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow, especially since my skill with lines was now only useful for building prisons in my own thoughts. One of the older men near me, a farmhand sent away for poaching a squire's rabbit, coughed a dry, rattling cough that shook his whole frame. He never spoke of his crime, but the injustice was etched on his face. We rarely spoke to one another, as words required energy we did not have to spare. Yet a silent understanding passed between us. A shared nod in the gloom, the simple act of shifting slightly to give another man an inch more room, became our form of conversation. It was a small acknowledgement that we were all in this together, a community forged from shared misery and the creaking of 1,000 timbers. One evening, during the brief hour when a slice of gray light fell through the deck grating, I felt a familiar shape in the seam of my worn trousers. It was a small nub of charcoal, no bigger than my thumb, that I had pocketed from my workshop on the day they came for me. My fingers closed around it, the smooth, dusty texture, a shock of familiarity in this world of damp wool and splintered wood. It felt like holding the last piece of my old life. I kept it hidden, a secret promise to myself that the man who knew how to draw a perfect circle was still here, buried beneath the filth and despair. I knew that survival here was a matter of the mind. The body could endure the meager rations of salted pork and hard biscuit, and it could grow accustomed to the constant dampness. But the spirit was a more fragile thing. I saw men give up, their eyes growing dull and vacant, their bodies slumping a little lower each day until they simply stopped moving. They had let the darkness inside their heads grow until it matched the darkness of the hold. I could not let that happen. Part of me wanted to surrender to the endless rocking and the foulness, to simply fade away. Yet the draftsman in me, the part that believed in structure and purpose, refused. I would not let this place break my lines. Each night I would hold that little piece of charcoal, its familiar weight a comfort in my palm. I would feel its sharp edges and dusty surface and remember the purpose in my hands. I would close my eyes and draw my imaginary buildings, focusing on the precision of each line and the balance of each form.
It was a tiny act of rebellion, a declaration that even in the belly of a prison ship, a man could still create something straight and true, if only in his mind. This resolve became my anchor. While others moaned or cursed, I focused on the geometric purity of a hexagon. While the ship groaned, I mentally calculated the stress points on a perfectly balanced arch. Whispers circulated among the convicts about the horrors of other transport voyages, stories of disease and cruelty that made our current suffering seem mild. Some said half the men on the Friendship, one of the first ships to make this journey, had been sick before they even saw land. Such tales were a poison, meant to kill hope, and I refused to listen. I focused instead on a single, vital task: to endure this voyage without losing myself. My hands, once skilled with fine instruments, were now idle and soft, but my mind was my tool. I learned to measure the passing days by the subtle shifts in the ship's rhythm, to tell the time of day by the angle of the light through the grate. These small observations were like drawing points on a map of my own survival, creating a sense of order where none existed. It was a meager defense against the vast, uncaring ocean and the even more uncaring justice that had sent me here. The men around me were a collection of broken lives: weavers, farmers, tinkers, and thieves. Each had a story that had ended abruptly, their life's narrative torn in half. I wondered if they had their own mental workshops, their own secret ways of enduring. Perhaps the farmer imagined neat rows of spring crops, or the weaver pictured the intricate pattern of a loom. We were all clinging to something, some ghost of a former self, hoping it was substantial enough to carry us to whatever waited at the end of this journey. The darkness and the unending motion had tested my mind in ways I was only beginning to grasp. It was a crucible, burning away everything but the essential core of a person. For me, that core was the simple, stubborn belief in the power of a well-drawn line. It was all I had left, and I held on to it with the same quiet desperation that I held the piece of charcoal in my pocket. It was not a plan for the future, but it was enough to get me through the night. The initial shock of confinement eventually gave way to a grim, unending routine. Days were marked not by the sun, which we never saw, but by the changing shifts of the guards and the delivery of our meager food. The constant, unpredictable movement of the ship became a form of torment all its own. Every muscle in my body seemed to be in a perpetual state of tension, fighting the lurch and sway just to remain in one place. Lying on the hard bunk offered no relief. The motion worked its way into my bones, a deep, wearying rhythm that made even simple thoughts a struggle. This ceaseless rocking churned the stomach and unsettled the mind, leaving a dull ache that sleep could not erase. It was a physical reminder, every second of every day, that we were completely at the mercy of the ocean. This constant motion also ensured we were never truly dry. A fine, salty mist seemed to work its way through the very timbers of the ship, clinging to our clothes and bedding. Everything I touched had a damp, gritty feel. Consequently, the taste of salt was on my lips from morning until night. It was in the air I breathed, and it was certainly in our food. We were given portions of heavily salted pork, so tough it made my jaw ache.
and hard biscuits that were often crawling with weevils. The saltiness of the meat was overwhelming, a burning sensation on the tongue that water could not wash away. This diet, meant to preserve the food for the long journey, began to have a terrible effect on the men. It started quietly. A man near me complained that his teeth felt loose in his head, something he dismissed as a strange dream. Then another showed me dark, ugly bruises that had appeared on his legs, though he could not recall bumping into anything. Soon, the complaints became more common and more alarming. Men's gums began to swell and turn a dark, angry purple, bleeding at the slightest touch. A foul smell, a mix of rot and decay, began to join the other awful scents in the hold. We were all weakening, our bodies failing in a way that had nothing to do with chains or guards. This sickness, scurvy as the older sailors called it, was a creeping dread that stole a man's strength from the inside out. Watching this slow decay was a special kind of horror. The guards seemed indifferent, treating it as just another misery of the voyage. But for me, the randomness of it was the worst part. As a draftsman, my entire life had been built on order, on predictable outcomes, and the logic of straight lines and perfect angles. This illness was chaos. It followed no rules I could see, and it turned strong men into listless, groaning shells. A powerful, desperate need grew inside me, not just to survive, but to understand. If I could not stop it, perhaps I could at least map its progress. The thought was a small point of light in the suffocating darkness of our situation. This impulse drove me to take a risk. I still had the small nub of charcoal I had kept hidden, a secret link to my old life. But I needed a surface to draw on. During a brief period when a few of us were allowed on the lower deck for cleaning duties, I saw a piece of canvas, a torn scrap from a spare sail shoved into a corner. While the guard was distracted, I managed to fold it and hide it inside my shirt. My heart pounded against my ribs, the fear of being caught a sharp metallic taste in my mouth. Back in the hold, the rough texture of the canvas under my fingers felt like a lifeline. It was stained and imperfect, but it was a surface, a place to impose order. In the dim, shifting light from the grates above, I began my secret work. I chose a man in a nearby bunk, one whose decline was plain to see. I did not draw his face or try to capture his spirit. That would have felt like stealing something from him. Instead, I focused on the details of his affliction with a cold precision. I sketched the line of his jaw, showing how the gums had swollen over his teeth. I drew his hand, the knuckles enlarged and the skin stretched tight and shiny. It was not art. It was a record, a piece of data. My hand, once accustomed to the smooth glide of a pen over fine paper, now guided a rough piece of charcoal over coarse cloth. Each line was an act of defiance against the helplessness I felt. This quiet, dangerous work gave me a new purpose. While others sank into despair, I had a task that required all my concentration. I observed the subtle changes, the deepening of the bruises, the way a man's posture would collapse as the weakness took hold.
I was creating a visual timeline of decay, a draftsman's study of the human body breaking down. It makes one wonder, does it not, what remains of a person when their body begins to fail so completely? When all the familiar structures of life are gone, you are left with only what is inside your own mind. For me, that was the discipline of the line, the comfort of careful observation. This focus sharpened my senses in other ways as well. I began to notice things I had previously ignored. The slight changes in the groan of the ship's timbers that might signal a change in the weather, or the different ways men coughed, some dry and rattling, others thick and weak. I was no longer just a prisoner waiting for his fate. I was an observer, a chronicler of our grim world. The act of drawing, of making a mark that was precise and intentional, was a way of saying that I was still here, that my skills still had meaning, even in the belly of this miserable ship. The drawings were a grim collection, a catalogue of suffering that I kept hidden away, folded into the thinnest possible square. They were a terrible secret, yet they were also my salvation. They kept my mind sharp and gave me a sense of control in a place where I had none. While the ship carried my body toward an unknown shore and an uncertain future, my mind was busy with the familiar problems of shadow, line, and form. This quiet study of the sickness spreading through the hold was a strange and desperate anchor, but it kept me from being swept away by the current of despair. The grim task of charting the body's slow collapse stayed with me, a dark line drawn against the endless rolling sea. The grim rhythm of sickness below deck was broken by a new, more violent motion. For days, the rocking of the ship had been a predictable, lulling sickness, a cradle of misery. But this was different. The movements became sharp, unpredictable jerks that threw men against the damp wood of the hull. A deep, low moaning began, not from the convicts, but from the very bones of the ship itself. It was a sound of immense strain, of timbers complaining under a pressure I could not yet see. The air, which I had thought could not get any more unpleasant, now seemed to carry a new charge to it, a strange energy to it, that made the hairs on my arms stand up. This new violence in the ship's roll made my careful work impossible. The sailcloth sketch of my fellow convict's decline slid from my lap, the charcoal smudging the grim lines of his swollen limbs. He was too weak to even notice. From above, a new sound joined the groaning of the wood, a high, thin whistle that grew into a sustained howl. An old sailor, a man convicted for smuggling, muttered a name for it under his breath: the fiddler's green. He claimed it was the sound of the wind in the rigging, a tune played to call men to a watery grave. While I didn't believe in such tales, the sound itself was enough to plant a seed of pure, cold fear in my gut. Suddenly, the hatch above us was thrown open with a crash. A torrent of stinging spray rained down into our dark world, and with it came the bellowing voice of a ship's officer. He was not calling for sailors, but for us. "All hands, all who can stand, on deck now! Cargo's shifted." The order was so shocking that for a moment no one moved. We were cargo, not crew. But the desperation in his voice was clear. This was not a request. Consequently, men began to stir, a slow, clumsy scramble of weak bodies pulling themselves toward the ladder, driven by a fear of the lash that was, for the moment, greater than their fear of the unknown storm. Climbing that ladder was like ascending into another world. As my head cleared the hatch, the full force of the gale hit me. It was not like wind I had ever known in London. It was a solid thing, a wall of moving air that made it hard to draw a breath. It tore at my thin shirt and plastered my hair to my skull. The howl I had heard from below was now a deafening, all-encompassing roar, mixed with the explosive crash of water against the sides of the ship. The deck was a terrifying scene of chaos, tilting at an angle so steep it was a miracle anyone could stand. It was slick with a constant wash of seawater, and my bare feet, so used to the rough but stable floor of the hold, struggled to find any purchase at all. My eyes struggled to make sense of the scene. Waves, the size of London houses, rose up on all sides, their bray peaks streaked with white foam. The sky was the color of a bruise. In the middle of the deck, the source of the emergency was clear. A massive wooden crate, larger than any I had helped load, had broken its chains and was slatting with each violent roll of the ship. It moved with terrifying momentum, a battering ram that threatened to smash through the ship's railing and take a section of the hull with it. A handful of sailors were trying to wrestle it with thick ropes, their faces grim and set. An officer shoved a length of coarse, wet rope into my hands. "Here, pull when I give the word. Pull like your life depends on it, because it does." The rope felt alien in my grasp. My hands, accustomed to the delicate pressure of a charcoal stick or the smooth wood of a ruler, were instantly raw. The fibers, stiff with salt and water, dug into my skin. Alongside me, other convicts, their faces pale with terror and seasickness, grabbed the same line. We were a pathetic-looking crew, but our shared fear gave us a strange, temporary unity. We all watched the officer, waiting for his command. He waited for the ship to lurch in the opposite direction, a brief moment where the crate began to slide away from the edge. "Heave!" he screamed, his voice barely audible above the storm. We threw our collective weight onto the rope. The strain was immediate and agonizing. My muscles, weak from confinement and poor food, screamed in protest. My feet slipped on the wet planks, and I only stayed upright because of the press of the man behind me. I could feel the rope tearing at the skin on my palms, but the immediate danger of the sliding crate was so great that the pain barely registered. In that frantic struggle, I witnessed a kind of expertise I had never imagined. The ship's officers and seasoned sailors moved with a grim efficiency that was both terrifying and beautiful. They understood the rhythm of the storm, leaning into the roll of the ship, using its own motion to their advantage. They shouted commands that were not just words, but calculations of force and balance. I, a man who could draw the most complex of arches and calculate the stress on any beam, was a complete novice here. I was learning the profound difference between plotting a perfect line on paper and desperately trying to hold a frayed one against the fury of the ocean. A colossal wave, larger than any before it, rose up and broke over the side. For a terrifying second, the world was nothing but a crushing weight of green and white water. It knocked me from my feet, slamming me against the ship's mast. The shock of the cold was so intense, it stole the air from my lungs. I gasped, swallowing a mouthful of bitter salt water that burned my throat. When the water receded, I was left shivering, soaked to the bone, with the taste of the ocean deep inside me. Someone hauled me to my feet, and I found myself grabbing the rope again, driven by pure instinct. Through our combined, ragged effort, we managed to drag the crate back towards the center of the ship. The sailors, working with astonishing speed, threw fresh chains around it, hammering pins into place to secure it. The immediate danger had passed. I stood there, leaning against the mast, my entire body trembling from cold and exertion. My hands were a mess of raw, bleeding skin. I looked out at the churning sea, no longer just a backdrop to our voyage, but a living, breathing monster of immense power. It made the cruelties of guards and the misery of the hold seem small and insignificant.
The officer gave a curt nod. "Back below, the lot of you," he ordered, his voice already turning back to its usual tone of dismissal. The journey down the ladder was slower, each step an agony for my aching muscles. As I descended back into the familiar gloom and stench of the hold, the relative quiet felt strange. The storm still raged outside, but down here we were once more removed from its direct power. The other convicts collapsed onto the floorboards, groaning. An older man next to me managed a weak, cracked smile. "Well, lad," he rasped, "at least you won't have to wonder if you'll ever learn to swim." I sat with my back against the hull, feeling the deep vibration of the storm through the wood. Before, this groaning ship had been my prison, but now, having seen what it was enduring on our behalf, I felt a strange new respect for it. For all its flaws and the misery it held, its construction was sound enough to withstand that onslaught. The lines and joints, designed by some draftsman long ago, were holding firm against a force that I now understood on a physical level. My own drawings, the ones I held so dear in my mind, felt flimsy and unreal compared to the raw experience of the storm. A line drawn on paper is a promise, an idea of strength. But the tautness of that rope, the solid wood of the mast, the sheer force of that water, those were truths. I had survived, but I understood that my survival had depended on the practical skills of others and the strength of a design I could now appreciate in a whole new way. I had felt the raw, untamed power of the world, and it was a lesson that would be etched into me more deeply than any ink on paper. Summary. The protagonist is forced on deck during a violent storm to help secure shifting cargo, experiencing the raw power of the ocean and gaining a new physical understanding of force and structure that contrasts with his theoretical knowledge as a draftsman. End state. The storm continues, but the immediate danger is over, and the protagonist is back in the hold with a profound new respect for the ship and a deeper understanding of the difference between theoretical design and practical survival. The weeks that followed the great storm passed in a slow, monotonous rhythm of rocking wood and salted meat. The memory of the waves, however, had changed something within me. It was one thing to draw the plans for a bridge, to calculate the stresses and forces on paper. It was another thing entirely to feel those forces trying to tear your world apart. That raw physical lesson stayed with me long after the skies cleared. Then, one morning, a change in the endless routine stirred the men from their torpor. A different smell reached us, even in the hold, not of bilge water or tar, but of something green and earthy. A cry came down from the deck, a word we had almost forgotten: land. Being herded up into the light was a painful, blinding affair. I shielded my eyes with a hand that had grown pale and soft from disuse, and for a long moment all I could see were dancing spots of color. When my vision finally cleared, the sight before me was so unlike anything I had ever known that my mind struggled to give it shape or name. There was no gentle green of an English field, no familiar outline of oak or ash. Instead, strange gray-green trees stood in ragged formations, their leaves hanging down like tired fingers. The sounds were just as alien, not the cawing of crows or the chirping of sparrows, but a chorus of shrieks, whistles, and what sounded like mocking laughter from birds I could not see. My first step onto the shore was a betrayal. After months of my body learning the constant sway of the ocean, the solid ground felt unsteady and treacherous, and I stumbled like a newborn foal. The earth itself was a surprise, a mix of fine white sand and coarse dry vegetation that crunched underfoot. A sharp, almost medicinal scent, something like pine but harsher, came from the strange trees, mixing with the smells of salt and dry dirt. I drew a deep breath, and the unfamiliar sensations seemed to fill my lungs and my head at once. This was New South Wales. There was no grand harbor, no bustling city, just an endless expanse of muted color under a sky of the most piercing, unforgiving blue. Any faint hope that this new land meant a new beginning quickly soured into a bitter certainty. We were not colonists. We were prisoners in a larger, unenclosed jail. We were marched from the beach to a collection of rough-hewn wooden huts and lined up before a stern-faced officer who held a ledger. He did not ask for my name. He shouted a number, and a soldier shoved a bundle of rough, drab clothing into my arms. I was stripped of my own worn garments, the last physical connection to my life in London, and forced into a woolen uniform that scratched at my skin with 1,000 tiny needles. My identity, my profession, everything I had been, was erased and replaced by a number. Assigned to a labor gang, I soon learned the true nature of my sentence. Our overseer was a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in a scowl, and his authority was absolute. The work was simple and brutal. clearing the land. We were given axes with splintered handles and set upon the unyielding bush. The first swing of the heavy tool sent a jarring shock up my arms, a pain that started in my hands and ended in my shoulders. My palms, accustomed to the smooth, controlled glide of a pen or the delicate edge of a ruler, were raw and blistered within the first hour. The effort of each breath grew as the day wore on. Sweat stung my eyes and plastered the horrible woolen shirt to my back. There was no escape from the persistent warmth, a kind of dry, steady heat that seemed to soak right into your bones. Shade was a rare and precious thing, something to be cherished for a few moments when the overseer's back was turned. My throat felt constantly dry, and the water we were given from a barrel was warm and tasted of wood and rust. All around me, the rhythmic thud of axes and the grunts of straining men became the only sounds that mattered, a grim percussion for our new lives.
This was a world without lines, without angles, without the comforting logic of geometry that had always ordered my thoughts. My mind, trained to see patterns and create structure, found nothing here to grasp. The trees grew in a chaotic tangle, their trunks twisted and their branches reaching in every direction. The land itself rose and fell without reason or design. To clear it felt less like construction and more like a mindless act of destruction, reducing this strange living place to a patch of bare, wounded earth. The work required no thought, only brute strength I did not possess. As I worked, I felt a crushing sense of disillusionment settle over me. I had been a draftsman. I had turned ideas into tangible plans, creating blueprints for buildings that would shelter people, for machines that would make their lives easier. My skill was in precision, in the careful application of knowledge to bring order from chaos. Here, that skill was worthless. I was no different from the pickpocket or the farmer or the hardened criminal laboring beside me. We were all just pairs of hands, instruments to be used until we broke. The injustice of it was a heavy weight, heavier even than the axe in my hands. Every movement became a slow, deliberate struggle against exhaustion. My muscles screamed in protest, unused to such relentless, repetitive strain. I watched the other convicts, men who were perhaps more used to physical labor, and saw the same grim determination on their faces. We did not speak much. There was no energy for it. We were united only by our shared misery and the watchful gaze of the overseer, who walked among us like a predator, quick to shout at anyone who slowed their pace. This was my new reality, a life measured in the swing of an axe and the ache in my back. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in colors I had never seen before. Pinks and oranges so vivid they seemed unreal. The change in light signaled the end of our labor for the day. We were marched back to the settlement, our tools shouldered, our bodies slick with grime and sweat. My hands throbbed with a fiery pain, and I could already feel the deep, sore stiffness that would greet me in the morning.
We were given a meager ration of salted meat and coarse bread, which I ate without tasting, my mind numb with fatigue. That night, lying on a hard wooden bunk in a crowded hut, I thought of my workshop in London. I pictured the clean, smooth surface of my drawing board, the comforting weight of my brass instruments, the crisp smell of paper and ink. It felt like a dream from another life, a world away from the man I had now become. I was 1,000 miles from everything I had ever known, stripped of my name, my craft, and my future. A bitter taste, not from the food, rose in my throat. The silence of this new continent was a presence in itself, punctuated by the strange nocturnal calls of unseen creatures. It was a vast, empty quiet that made the crowded city sounds of my memory feel like a warm blanket. In London, even at night, there was always the distant rumble of life. Here, there was only the wind moving through the odd, drooping leaves of the trees, and the soft breathing of the exhausted men around me. The same hands that had once translated the dreams of architects into precise, elegant lines now cradled only blisters and splinters, tools for a life I had never designed. This part of the journey detailed the protagonist's arrival in New South Wales, his disillusionment with the new start, the loss of his identity as he's processed into the penal system, and his first brutal experience with forced labor clearing the alien landscape. End state. The protagonist is now established as a number within a labor gang, physically and emotionally battered by his new reality, and struggling to reconcile his former life as a skilled draftsman with his current status as a convict laborer.
The days bled into one another, each one marked by the rhythmic thud of an axe and the sharp, metallic tang of my own sweat. My world had shrunk to the length of the axe handle in my grip, its wood splintered and unforgiving against the soft skin of my palms. We were clearing a stretch of land, felling strange, slender trees with peeling bark and leathery leaves that gave off a medicinal scent when they were crushed underfoot. In London, my hands were accustomed to the smooth, cool feel of a ruling pen and the delicate weight of a compass. Here, they were a mess of blisters that burst, wept, and hardened into yellow calluses, a raw and ugly map of my new life. Each swing of the axe sent a jarring shock up my arms, a brutal percussion that was the opposite of the quiet, measured lines I used to draw. This new work demanded a different kind of endurance. My shirt, a coarse woolen thing, was perpetually damp and stuck to my back, a constant, irritating presence. To catch my breath, I would lean on my axe and stare out at the unending expanse of gray-green bush, a landscape so monotonous and yet so full of unseen things. A constant low hum from countless insects I could not name formed a backdrop to everything, a sound that seemed to worm its way inside my head. The overseer, a man whose face was set in a permanent scowl, would pace the line of convicts, his silence more threatening than any shout. We learned to measure the day not by the clock, but by the slow crawl of our shadows and the growing ache in our lower backs. During these moments, my mind would flee. It would retreat from the stinging cuts on my hands and the gnawing emptiness in my belly, seeking refuge in the clean, orderly world I had lost. I would picture the perfect geometry of a Palladian window, the precise arc of a vaulted ceiling, or the satisfying logic of a structural diagram. These mental exercises were a shield, a way to keep a small part of myself separate from the brute reality of convict number 734. The memory of ink on paper, of a line drawn straight and true, was the only thing that felt real. Everything else was a harsh mix of sounds and sensations, a punishment designed to grind a man down to nothing more than a pair of hands and a strong back. Slow pace. One afternoon, during a brief pause while the overseer was occupied with a broken cartwheel, I found my chance. My eyes fell upon a piece of charcoal that had spilled from a cooking fire, a small black nub lying in the dust. My heart gave a little jump. Without a second thought, I bent down, my joints protesting, and palmed the piece, its gritty texture a ghost of a familiar comfort. It felt substantial, a tool. I glanced around. No one was watching. Nearby, a wide strip of bark had peeled from a felled tree, its inner surface a surprisingly smooth, pale canvas. The urge was irresistible, a thirst I hadn't realized I possessed. Moving to the shade of a large, gnarled tree, I knelt down. My hands trembled slightly as I touched the charcoal to the bark. I chose a small, tough-leafed plant growing nearby, one I had seen every day but never truly looked at. My focus narrowed, and for a few precious minutes, the sounds of the work gang faded away. The world became only the rough surface under my fingers and the dark line appearing upon it. I wasn't trying to create art. I was trying to understand, to impose order. I drew the serrated edge of a leaf, the way the veins branched from a central stem, the tight cluster of buds at its tip. It was an act of defiance, a way of saying that even here I could still see the world with a draftsman's eye. A shadow fell over my work, and I froze, my stomach tightening with fear. I expected a kick, a curse from the overseer. Instead, a low voice, raspy with age, spoke beside me. "You've got the shape of it right enough." I looked up to see one of the older convicts, a man who had once been a farmer back in Sussex, squinting down at my drawing. His face was a web of deep lines, but his eyes were clear and observant. He pointed a dirt-caked finger not at my drawing, but at the real plant beside it. "Funny little thing that is. They call it snakeweed here, though I doubt any snake has much to do with it." He hunkered down beside me, his knees cracking like dry twigs. He looked from my drawing to my raw, bleeding hands. Instead of mocking my strange pastime, he reached out and plucked a few leaves from the plant I had just sketched. "The art of it is fine," he said, his voice dropping lower, "but the use of it is better." He began to crush the leaves between his thumb and forefinger, releasing a sharp, clean scent that cut through the dusty air. A dark green paste formed on his skin. This gesture felt profoundly significant, as if he were sharing a secret from a forgotten world where knowledge mattered more than brute force. "Hold out your hand," the old farmer instructed. I did so, hesitantly. He carefully smeared the cool, wet mash over the worst of my sores. The relief was immediate, a gentle tingling that seemed to draw the fire out of my skin. It was a simple, practical magic. For weeks, my hands had been a source of constant pain, and in a single moment, this man had offered a solution derived from the very plant I had chosen to document. It was the first time my skill, the one that had landed me in this miserable place, had produced anything of tangible value in this new world. A quiet understanding passed between us. He didn't need to say more, and I had no words to offer. He simply nodded at my drawing on the bark, then at my treated hand, as if to say, "Your eyes saw the form, my memory knew its purpose. Together, that's something." This small interaction was more valuable than an extra ration of bread. It was a fragile connection, a bond forged not in shared misery, but in a moment of shared, practical wisdom. It was a reminder that even in a place designed to strip you of your identity, a man's true trade could never be entirely erased. That evening, as I lay on my rough straw pallet, the work gang's snores and grumbles filling our crude hut, I could still feel the cool sensation on my palms. The arguments among historians in London about the noble savage and the untamed wilderness seemed like utter nonsense now. There was a complex and ancient knowledge here, a subtle language spoken by the leaves and the soil, but it was a language we newcomers were deaf to. The old farmer knew a single word of it, a fragment learned through desperation or from someone else long gone, and it was enough to make a difference. I looked at my hands in the faint moonlight filtering through the cracks in the wall. They were still the hands of a convict, calloused and stained, but they felt different. They were the hands that had held a piece of charcoal and drawn a line, and that line had led to a small bit of healing. The knowledge I had stumbled upon, a partnership between a draftsman's eye and a farmer's memory, felt both powerful and frighteningly small. It was a single, useful truth in a vast and hostile wilderness. The bond formed with the old farmer over that simple drawing was a small, warm thing in a world of cold iron and indifference. For a few weeks, that shared knowledge felt like a shield. He would point out a tree with bitter bark, good for fevers, and I would remember its leaf shape with a few strokes of charcoal on a scrap of wood. It was a language of survival we were building together, a quiet act of mapping our new world in terms of what could help or harm. But this small comfort, this sense of slowly gaining control, was a fragile thing. The news came down the line of convicts like a cold wind, passed from the overseers in sharp barks. A supply ship was overdue, presumed lost. Rations were to be cut again. That single announcement changed everything. The dull ache of constant hunger sharpened into a painful, gnawing emptiness that lived in the pit of my stomach. Our daily portion of thin, gray gruel became even more watery, tasting of little more than boiled grain and disappointment. Work in the clearing became a slow-motion torment.
Lifting the axe required a conscious effort of will that left my arms trembling, and each swing sent a dizzying wave through my head. I began to notice the small details of starvation in the men around me, the sunken look of their eyes, the slow, shuffling way they moved, the quiet that fell over the camp as men saved their energy for the work they were forced to do. The world seemed to shrink to the single desperate need for food. It was during this slow decline that opportunity appeared, not as a bright light, but as a muttered complaint on a hot afternoon. I was tasked with carrying a bucket of fresh water to the small tent that served as an office for the junior officers, the men who managed the daily logistics of the work gangs. My movements were sluggish, each breath requiring a little more effort than the last. As I neared the tent, I heard the crisp, educated voice of a young officer, sharp with frustration. He was speaking to a sergeant, his words cutting through the quiet buzz of insects. "It's useless," the officer said, and I saw him slap a roll of parchment onto the rough wooden table. "How can we possibly lay out a new farming plot with this? The contours are wrong. The watercourse is marked a quarter mile from where it actually runs. It's a child's scribble." I stopped, just out of sight, the weight of the water bucket suddenly forgotten. My heart gave a painful thud against my ribs. A map. They were talking about a map. Peeking around the edge of the canvas flap, I could see the offending document. It was exactly as he described, a crude drawing with clumsy lines and no sense of proper scale, the kind of thing a sailor might sketch from memory. My mind, a place that had become foggy with hunger, suddenly cleared. I saw it not as a piece of poor work, but as a void, an empty space where my own skill could fit. In an instant, I could picture it, a proper map drawn to scale, with clean lines indicating the rise and fall of the land, the gentle curve of the creek, the patches of good soil the farmer had told me about. The idea was a terrifying flash of light in the gray fog of my existence.
For days, the thought consumed me. It was a constant battle fought inside my own head while my body went through the motions of felling trees and clearing scrub. One part of me, the convict part that had learned to be invisible, screamed in terror. To speak out of turn, to approach an officer, a free man, with such a bold proposition was madness. It was arrogance. For a prisoner to claim he could do a better job than one of the king's own men was an insult that would be answered with the sting of the lash, or worse, a transfer to a punishment gang where the work was harder and the food even scarcer. The memory of the overseer's cold eyes and the casual cruelty of the guards was a powerful argument for silence. I felt the familiar weight of my sentence, a heavy cloak that urged me to keep my head down and my mouth shut. Yet another voice, one I hadn't heard in a long time, fought back. It was the draftsman's voice, the part of me that despised poor work and yearned for precision and order. More powerful than that, however, was the gnawing emptiness in my belly. Every time a wave of dizziness washed over me as I stood up too quickly, every time I saw the bones becoming more prominent in my own hands, the fear of starvation grew. It was a slow, creeping terror, less dramatic than a flogging, but far more certain. I began to realize that silence was also a sentence. It was a sentence to waste away, to become another anonymous body buried in this strange, unforgiving soil. The risk of the lash was sharp and immediate, but the risk of doing nothing was absolute. What finally pushed me toward action was the sight of the old farmer. He was a tough man, wiry and resilient, but the cuts in rations were wearing him down. I saw him stumble one morning, his legs simply giving out from weakness. Another convict and I had to help him to his feet, and I was shocked by how little he weighed. He tried to laugh it off, but I saw the fear in his eyes. He was a good man who had shown me kindness, and his quiet knowledge of this land was a treasure. The thought of watching him fade away because of a poorly drawn map was something I could not accept. My survival was tied to his, and perhaps his was now tied to a desperate idea blooming in the mind of a disgraced printer.
So the choice was made, not in a moment of grand courage, but in a quiet resolve born of desperation. That evening, I used my small water ration to wash the grime from my face and hands as best I could. I tried to smooth my tattered woolen uniform, a hopeless gesture, but one that felt necessary. I was not just a laborer with an axe. I was, for this one moment, a man with a specific and valuable skill. I had to look the part, however poorly. I rehearsed the words in my head, trying to make them sound respectful and useful, not arrogant or demanding. My throat was dry and my hands felt cold, but the internal debate was over. There was only the act itself left to perform. The next day, I saw my chance. The junior officer was standing alone near the edge of the clearing, looking out over the valley that was intended for the new farms. He held that same flawed map in his hand, his expression a mix of frustration and exhaustion. My legs felt like lead as I walked toward him. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to blend back into the line of gray-clad convicts. But I kept walking, my eyes fixed on my destination. I stopped a respectful distance away and waited, my heart hammering against my ribs so loudly I was sure he could hear it. He finally noticed me, his eyes narrowing with impatience. "What is it, convict?" he asked, his voice sharp. The words I had practiced so carefully fell from my lips in a nervous rush. "Sir," I began, my voice barely a whisper at first, forcing myself to speak louder. "I happened to overhear your concerns about the new survey map. In London, I was a draftsman. I am trained in cartography, the science of map-making, and technical drawing. I believe I can create a true and accurate map of this valley for you, one that will show the proper contours of the land and the location of the best soil for planting." I held my breath, waiting for the explosion of anger, the dismissal, the call for the guards. The officer simply stared at me for a long moment. His face showed a flicker of disbelief, then a deep suspicion. A convict, a common criminal, claiming such a refined skill? It was absurd. He looked me up and down, from my worn-out boots to my thin face. I could see him weighing the possibility. On one hand, there was the sheer unlikeliness of my claim and the risk of being made a fool of. On the other, there was the useless map in his hand and the pressure from his superiors to get the new farmland established before the colony's food situation grew even more dire. His gaze was intense, a physical pressure that made me want to shrink away. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and cold, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "You make a bold claim. If you are lying, I will see you get a dozen lashes for your insolence. If you waste my time, you will regret it." He paused, letting the threat settle. "But if what you say is true, you will have a chance to prove it, a real chance." He did not promise more food or better treatment, only a test. It was more than I had dared to hope for. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. This single, desperate gamble had not yet saved me, but it had altered the very ground beneath my feet, offering a path that was not there an hour before. Summary: faced with crippling starvation due to ration cuts, the protagonist overhears an officer's frustration with a poor map, leading him to overcome his fear and offer his professional draftsmanship skills in a desperate bid for survival. End state: the protagonist has successfully convinced a skeptical officer to give him a chance to prove his mapping abilities, with the outcome hanging in the balance, and the stakes set at either severe punishment or a potential escape from manual labor. The officer's eyes, the color of a winter sea, held a look that was part curiosity and part dismissal. He gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture that sealed my desperate bargain. "You have until sundown tomorrow," he stated, his voice flat. "Show me something more useful than the scrawls I already possess. Do not waste my time." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving me standing there with the weight of my own foolish promise pressing down on my shoulders. A cold dread washed over me, a feeling that I had just traded a slow death by labor for a much faster one by way of the lash for my impertinence. My boast felt hollow now, a foolish echo in the vast, silent landscape. My first task was not one of lines and angles, but of scavenging. Proper paper was a treasure beyond imagining, and my drawing instruments were leagues away in a forgotten London workshop. My search led me down to the small creek that bordered the settlement. There, amongst the water-worn pebbles, I searched for a surface. My fingers, clumsy and stiff from the axe handle, brushed over dozens of stones until I found one. It was a large, flat piece of slate, nearly 2 feet across, with a surface ground almost perfectly smooth by the patient water. It was heavy, and carrying it back to the crude huts felt like hoisting my own tombstone, but its cool, solid presence was also a small comfort. It was something real, something to build upon. Next came the charcoal. I went to the old farmer, who was sitting by a small fire, nursing his aching back. He watched me approach, his expression unreadable. When I explained my need, he simply grunted and pointed a crooked finger toward the remains of a specific tree they had burned the day before. "That one," he said, his voice a low rumble, "burns clean, makes a fine black powder if you grind it well." The process involved crushing the brittle black sticks between 2 smaller rocks, a slow and dusty business that coated my hands and face in soot. It was a messy, imperfect substitute for the fine sticks of graphite I once used, but as the pile of fine dark powder grew, so did a sliver of hope. With my materials assembled, I sought out the farmer again. This was the most important part of my plan, the element the officer's official maps would never have. I spread a piece of torn sailcloth, salvaged from the voyage, over the ground and placed my heavy slate tablet beside it. "I need your eyes," I told him quietly. "I can draw the shape of the land, but you know its heart." For the next several hours, we worked. He spoke of the subtle changes in the color of the soil, pointing out which patches were rich and dark and which were sandy and pale. He traced the likely path of the creek in the dry season and knew, just by the type of low-lying scrub, where the ground would hold water and turn to swamp after a rain. This was a different kind of knowledge, one learned not from books, but from a lifetime of watching things grow. As he spoke, I drew. My fingers, stained black with powder, felt a ghost of their old nimbleness returning. I used the edge of a flat shard of rock to rule straight lines, estimating scale with a piece of knotted twine. The officer wanted a map of plots for farming, and so I gave him one. But I added the farmer's wisdom to it. I marked the good soil with a cross-hatching pattern, and the marshy ground with wavy lines. I drew the hidden creek not a simple blue line, but as a thicker, vital artery, the key to surviving the dry months. It was not a pretty map, not the sort of elegant plan I would have presented to a client in London, but it was honest. Every line on it meant something. This is where you can build. This is where your crops will thrive. And this is where you will fail. Presenting it to the officer felt like walking to the gallows. I held the heavy slate in my arms, my heart thumping against my ribs. He took it from me without a word, his eyes scanning the surface. He traced the line of the creek with his finger, his brow furrowed in concentration. He then looked over at the official, cruder map he had complained about, comparing the two. The silence stretched on, filled only by the distant ring of axes on wood. I prepared myself for the inevitable cuff, the order for me to be taken away for my insolence. Instead, he looked directly at me. "Where did you learn of this creek bed?" he asked, his tone sharp. "It is not on any of our charts." "I was told of it, sir," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "by a man who knows the soil." A flicker of something, perhaps understanding, perhaps respect, passed through his gaze. He handed the slate back to me. "You will join the surveying party at first light. You will report to me. They will show you how to use proper instruments." And just like that, it was done. He walked away, leaving me stunned. The weight of the stone in my hands now felt entirely different. It was no longer a tombstone. It was a foundation. This was the system of assignment I had heard whispers about, where a man's skills could lift him from the common drudgery, if he could prove their worth. The news of my reassignment moved through the camp like a ripple in a pond. As I ate my dinner that evening, a portion of stew with actual chunks of meat that I could chew, I felt the eyes of the other men on me. Some were looks of pure envy, a bitter resentment that I had found a way out of the back-breaking labor that awaited them tomorrow. Others were simply curious. But when I looked across the fire, I saw the old farmer. He caught my eye and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a simple gesture,
but it cemented a bond between us. We were two men with different kinds of knowledge who together had created something more valuable than either of us could have alone.
He had provided the substance, and I had given it a shape he could understand. Historical accounts from the time often focus on the official surveyors and their grand maps, but they rarely mention the quiet, essential knowledge passed between convicts, the wisdom that truly determined whether a plot of land would yield life or despair. Scholars still debate how much of the early colony's success was built on such informal collaborations, a world away from the official records in London. For my part, I knew I had stumbled upon a fundamental truth of this new world. Survival here was not just about enduring punishment. It was about seeing the hidden value in others. The stew was warm in my belly, a feeling I had not truly experienced in months. It was more than just food. It was a tangible result of my gamble, a confirmation that my life's work was not useless here. Across the settlement, the sound of the labor gangs returning from the forests filled the evening, a chorus of exhausted coughs and weary groans. That sound was no longer my future. I carried the memory of the smooth stone and the farmer's quiet wisdom with me, knowing my line had finally found a new and useful direction. My new life, if one could call it that, had settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the officer's commands. Days were spent tramping through dense bushland that seemed to actively resist our presence. Thorny vines snagged at my woolen uniform, and the ground itself was a trap of tangled roots and loose stones. The work of surveying was familiar in principle, yet utterly alien in practice. In London, my lines defined streets and buildings already tamed by man. Here, my lines were the first violation, a set of abstract rules I was imposing upon a world that had none. Each day I wiped sweat from my brow, not just from the warmth, but from the sheer effort of pushing through the undergrowth, my legs burning with a fatigue that settled deep in my bones.
The officer, a man of sharp angles and even sharper commands, saw only distances to be measured and elevations to be recorded. For him, this was a blank canvas waiting for the governor's grand design. For the two red-coated soldiers who accompanied us, it was merely tedious duty. But for me, the quiet of this place had begun to work its way inside me. It was a silence unlike any I had ever known. Not the absence of sound, but a presence of its own, woven from the strange musical calls of birds, the ceaseless hum of insects, and the whisper of wind through the stiff, oily leaves of the eucalyptus trees. This constant, living quiet made our own noises, the snap of a twig underfoot, the clink of a metal tool, seem like intrusions, loud and clumsy interruptions. Following this newfound awareness, my work began to change. I still drew the lines the officer demanded, marking out potential plots and charting the course of small streams. My hand was steady, my measurements precise. Yet, around the edges of my official maps, I began to add small, private details. I sketched the fan-like shape of a fern I'd never seen before, the intricate pattern of bark on a massive tree, and the way a rock formation seemed to mimic the shape of a resting animal. The officer never noticed these additions, seeing only the data he required. Because of this, my secret catalog grew, a personal record of a world that felt less and less empty with each passing day. It was a small act of defiance, a way of seeing the land for what it was,
not just what it could be forced to become. We had been walking for several hours one morning, deeper into the bush than we had ever gone before, when the soldier at the front of our small party stopped dead. He did not turn, but simply raised a hand, a silent command for stillness. The officer froze, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his belt. The normal sounds of the bush seemed to fall away, leaving only the sound of my own heart thudding against my ribs. My breath caught in my throat. Across a small, sun-dappled clearing, perhaps 50 yards away, a small group of people stood watching us. They were utterly still, their dark skin seeming to be part of the shadows cast by the tall, slender trees. They held long, thin spears, but not in a threatening way. They simply held them as if they were an extension of their own arms.
A prickle of sweat traced a path down my neck, a feeling born of pure tension rather than the day's warmth. They were not like the convicts, stooped and broken by labor, nor like the soldiers, rigid and confined in their bright uniforms. These people stood with an ease and a confidence that was startling. They belonged here. Their bare feet rested on the earth as if they had grown from it. There was no fear in their eyes, only a calm, profound curiosity. It was we who were the intruders, the strange, pale creatures who made so much noise and wore such foolish, heavy clothing. For a long moment, no one moved. We stared at them, and they stared back, two different worlds holding their breath in the same quiet space. In that silent exchange, a thought struck me with the force of a physical blow. All my knowledge, all my training as a draftsman felt suddenly hollow. I knew the principles of Palladian architecture, the precise geometry needed to build a perfect arch, the engineering required for a bridge to span the Thames. But what good was any of that here? What use were right angles and perfect circles in a land of twisting branches and meandering creeks? My skills were designed to conquer a landscape, to flatten and divide it into manageable squares. By contrast, these people did not seem to be fighting the land at all. They were living within its lines, not drawing their own. My hand, almost of its own will, went to the satchel where I kept my drawing supplies. Part of me screamed that this was a foolish, dangerous impulse. The officer's cold eyes were fixed on the clearing, and any unexpected movement could be seen as a threat. Yet the draftsman in me, the part that sought to understand the world by capturing its form on paper, was stronger than my fear. I saw the structures in their small camp beyond the clearing. Not houses, but shelters made of bark and branches, curved like the back of a sleeping animal. They were so simple, yet so perfectly suited to their purpose. I had to understand them. Slowly, carefully, I drew out a sheet of paper and a stick of charcoal. Hoping the officer was too focused to notice, I began to sketch, using a flat rock on my knee as a makeshift desk. I did not draw the people. That felt like a violation, a theft. Instead, I focused on their camp, my charcoal moving quickly to capture the essentials. I drew the elegant, functional curve of their shelters, noting how they were positioned to take advantage of the shade from a cluster of broad-leafed trees. I marked the location of their small, smoldering fire, placed centrally for warmth and cooking. A faint, pleasant scent of wood smoke drifted towards us, a smell of home and hearth that was universally understood. My drawing was not art. It was an analysis, an attempt to decode a design more brilliant than any I had studied in London. This process of documentation led to a powerful realization. The camp was a masterclass in efficiency. Nothing was wasted. The materials were taken directly from the surrounding forest, and the forms were dictated by the needs of the people and the nature of the environment. A fishing net woven from some kind of fibrous plant lay drying on a rock. A collection of shells was arranged near the fire, likely for use as tools. Every object had a place and a purpose. My survival in this new land, I suddenly understood, would not depend on my ability to impose my old knowledge. Rather, it would depend on my ability to learn the lessons this ancient place had to teach, lessons these silent watchers had mastered centuries ago. The officer finally lowered his hand, letting out a breath I hadn't realized he was holding. He seemed to decide the silent observers were no threat, or perhaps simply not relevant to his task of measuring the land. He gave a curt nod to the lead soldier, a signal to continue our march. As we moved, he shot a sideways glance at me and the paper on my knee. He saw the drawing of the shelters. A flicker of something, disdain perhaps, or simple confusion, crossed his face before he turned away, dismissing it as another of the convict draftsman's eccentricities. He could not possibly understand that what I held was more than a simple sketch. It was the beginning of a new education. As we continued our survey, the land no longer felt empty to me. I started to see signs I would have previously missed. A subtle trail through the dense undergrowth, a series of notches cut into the trunk of a tree, a pile of discarded shells by a creek bed. These were marks of a civilization far older and more attuned to this world than our own fledgling colony. The map I was drawing for the crown felt like a child's crayon scrawl over a master's painting. We were charting territory that was already known, naming features that already had names, and claiming land that was already home to a people who understood it in a way we never could. The rest of the day's work felt different. My lines and measurements seemed clumsy, my purpose less certain. I was still a prisoner, still bound to the officer's will, but a seed of change had been planted. I was beginning to see this place not as a prison or a blank slate, but as a complex and ancient text that I had only just begun to read. The challenge was no longer just about survival, but about understanding. The charcoal in my hand felt less like a tool of the crown and more like my own key to comprehending this strange, beautiful, and intimidating new world. That evening, back in the temporary camp, I took out the sketch again. Under the flickering light of our own fire, I added more detail from memory, trying to refine the lines, to capture the profound logic of what I had seen. The old farmer convict, with whom I had shared the secret of the soothing leaves, came over and looked at my work. He didn't speak for a long time, just studied the drawing of the shelters and the layout of the camp. Then he nodded slowly. "They know the soil," he said, his voice low. "They know the water. They know the seasons." It was a simple statement, but it confirmed everything I had felt. My mission to map the land for others had become a personal quest to truly see it for myself. Our small surveying party had pushed inland for a week, and my body had learned a new, unwelcome rhythm. It was a rhythm of constant motion, the swing of my arms matching the steady tread of my boots over uneven ground. The old farmer convict walked beside me, his steps more measured, his eyes scanning the trees with a quiet knowledge I was beginning to envy. My own focus was on the junior officer ahead, his red coat a stark slash of color against the endless gray-green of the bush. We were mapping a line for a future road, a task that sounded grand back in the settlement, but felt like a fool's errand out here. The work was demanding, requiring us to drag a heavy gunter's chain, a measuring tool made of 100 iron links, through dense scrub. Its metallic clinking a constant companion to the shrieking calls of unseen birds. This steady progress came to an abrupt halt. The officer stopped so suddenly that the soldier behind him nearly walked into his back. Through a final screen of broad-leafed trees, I saw the reason. A river, wider than any I had seen in this new land, churned before us. It was not a gentle, meandering stream, but a brown, muscular force, carrying branches and debris along in its swift current. The sound of it was a deep, continuous roar that seemed to vibrate up through the soles of my boots. The officer swore under his breath, unfolding his flimsy, half-finished map. A long, grim silence settled over our group, broken only by the river's relentless noise. Each man knew what this meant. After several minutes of studying the useless paper, the officer announced the inevitable. "We'll have to detour," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "Head north. We might find a crossing in 20 miles, maybe 30. A collective sigh, unspoken but deeply felt, passed through the men. 30 miles of this terrain was another 3 or 4 days of marching, of cutting our way through the bush, of stretching our already dwindling rations of salted pork and hard biscuit. I saw the shoulders of the soldiers slump. For them, it was a wearisome duty. For myself and the old farmer, it was a sentence of more hunger and exhaustion. My gaze followed the powerful flow of the water, my mind tracing its path as if it were a line of ink I could somehow erase and redraw. That was when the idea took hold, a spark of professional pride in the midst of my convict's despair. I saw not just a barrier, but a problem of geometry and landscape. The river was a line, and every line has a point of weakness. My eyes were drawn to a high, rocky ridge that rose steeply from our side of the bank, overlooking the river's course for what must have been miles. From up there, I could see its true shape, not just this single intimidating stretch. Part of me screamed to stay quiet, to not draw attention to myself. A convict's opinion was worth less than the dirt on his boots. But another part, the draftsman who had once plotted the precise angles of London buildings, felt a pull he could not ignore. This was a puzzle I knew how to solve. Taking a breath that did little to calm the frantic beating in my chest, I stepped forward. "Sir," I began, my voice sounding thin against the river's roar. The officer turned, his expression a mask of impatience. I did not offer a solution directly. That would have been insolence. Instead, I offered a perspective. "From that ridge," I said, pointing, "a man might be able to see the river's character, to sketch its path, and perhaps find a place where it widens and slows." I was careful with my words, framing it as an act of observation, of documentation. I was offering my eyes and my hand, not my judgment. He stared at the ridge, then back at me,
his gaze weighing my past usefulness against the sheer audacity of the suggestion. To my profound surprise, he nodded. "Go on then," he said gruffly, "but be quick about it." The climb was harder than it looked. My hands, calloused from weeks of labor, but still not accustomed to this wildness, were scraped raw by the sharp edges of the rock. I pulled myself up using the thick, stringy roots of trees that clung to the hillside. With each foot of elevation I gained, the air seemed to change, carrying the scent of dry stone and crushed leaves instead of the river's damp earth. The world below began to transform, the intimidating bush flattening into a textured carpet of greens and browns, its complexities resolving into a clear, understandable pattern. The river became a single, winding line carved into the landscape. Reaching the summit, I sat for a moment, my lungs burning, and pulled a piece of smooth bark and a nub of charcoal from my satchel. This was my sanctuary. As my hand moved, the world resolved into a series of lines and shaded patches. I ignored the individual trees and focused on the broader patterns they formed. My eye followed the river's course downstream. I saw where its channel narrowed, the water undoubtedly deep and fast. And then, about a mile away, I saw it. The river made a wide, gentle curve. Along the inside of that bend, the vegetation was different. A wide bank of pale green reeds and low, feathery trees thrived there, suggesting that the water moved slowly enough to deposit silt, not scour the earth away. It was a place where the river's power might be diminished, a subtle clue written in the language of the land itself. I scrambled back down the ridge, the piece of bark held carefully in my hand. I presented it to the officer without a word, letting the drawing speak for itself. He took it, his eyes tracing the lines I had made. "Here, sir," I said, my finger pointing to the wide bend. "The trees and reeds grow differently. It looks like a shallow place, perhaps a gravel bed, not deep mud." I explained that the fast-moving water would strip the banks bare, but these plants could only survive where the current was gentle and the footing firm. It was a guess, but it was an educated one, grounded in the logic of how water shapes the world. It was the same logic I used to determine where to place a foundation for a building. The officer looked from my drawing to the distant curve of the river, then back to my face. The soldiers and the old farmer watched us, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and doubt. He was being asked to trust a convict's eye for landscape over his military training and the accepted hardship of a long detour. For a long moment, I thought he would dismiss it, that he would choose the certainty of a miserable march over the uncertainty of my proposal. Then, with a decisive snap, he folded his own map and tucked it into his coat. "Very well," he said to the party at large, "we'll try the draftsman's path." A current of relief and tension passed through me in equal measure. My drawing was no longer just a theory. We marched for another hour, following the riverbank until we reached the spot I had marked. From ground level, it looked little different from the rest of the river. But as we drew closer, we could see the reeds I had spotted from above. The water did seem to move with less fury here. A brawny soldier was sent in first, using a long branch to probe the riverbed ahead of him.
The water rose to his knees, then his waist, but no higher. He called back that the bottom was hard, covered in smooth stones. One by one we crossed, the pull of the current strong but manageable. The shock of the cool water on my legs was a welcome relief, and the solid footing beneath me felt like the most wonderful thing in the world. We were all across in less than half an hour. On the far bank, as we wrung out our wet trousers, the officer came over to me. He didn't offer praise or thanks, but simply put a hand on my shoulder for a moment and gave a firm nod before turning away to give his next orders. That single, silent gesture changed everything. The other convicts now saw me not as a man with a strange, useless hobby, but as someone whose skill had a tangible worth. The soldiers looked at me with a grudging respect. I had used my lines on a piece of bark to alter our path, to save us from days of pointless suffering. The full meaning of what had been gained, a form of trust more valuable than any ration, would only become clear in the days that followed. My success with the surveying party did not go unnoticed. Upon our return to the settlement, the officer spoke well of my work, and his words carried weight. It meant I was not sent back to the gangs clearing trees, my hands spared from the splintered axe handle. Instead, a new duty was assigned to me, one that brought a faint echo of my old life in London. The governor had ordered the construction of a new barracks for the soldiers, a proper stone building to replace the flimsy wooden huts, and I was tasked with creating the official drawings, a complete record of its progress from foundation to rooftop. This new role felt like a breath of fresh air after months in the wilderness. I was given a small stool at a plank table under an awning, shielded from the worst of the day's glare, and provided with decent paper and charcoal. The construction site was a hive of structured activity, a world away from the silent bush. The rhythmic chip, chip, chip of masons' hammers shaping stone became the new sound of my days, replacing the calls of unfamiliar birds. Dust from sandstone hung in the air, a fine grit that settled on my paper and coated the back of my tongue with a dry, earthy taste. I found a certain comfort in it all. Here were lines and angles, problems of load and support that I understood. My first task was simple: to draw the foundations as they were being laid. I spent hours observing the men, the sweat slick on their backs as they heaved blocks of stone into the deep trench that had been dug. For the first time in this land, I felt a flicker of my old self, the draftsman who found satisfaction in precision and solid design. It was this focus on precision, however, that first pricked my unease. The original plans, drafted by an army engineer years ago, specified a foundation of hard, dark granite, the kind we had seen in outcrops miles from the settlement. But the stone being lowered into the trench was not granite. It was a pale, yellowish sandstone, and I could see how easily it flaked under the masons' hammers. Furthermore, I watched the men mixing the mortar, the substance that would bind the stones together. The pile of sand they used was enormous compared to the small measure of precious lime, meaning the resulting mixture would be weak and brittle. Every principle of construction I had ever studied screamed that this was wrong. A building is only as strong as its base, and this one was being built upon a flaw. This observation put a knot of fear in my stomach. The man in charge of the work was a civilian overseer, a stout individual with a perpetually flushed face and hands that were always suspiciously clean. He patrolled the site with a swagger, his authority absolute. To question his methods would be to question him. And I was still a convict, a man with no rights and a back that remembered the threat of the lash all too well. Yet the thought of all those soldiers sleeping in a barracks built on a crumbling foundation was a heavy weight. I saw in my mind the clean lines of my drawings, a depiction of strength and permanence, and knew it would be a lie that could one day cost men their lives. For several days, I said nothing, simply sketching the dimensions of the trench and the placement of the first course of stones.
Finally, my professional conscience won out over my fear, at least in part. I chose a moment when the overseer was reviewing my initial sketches. My voice felt tight in my throat as I pointed to the material notes on the engineer's original plan. "Sir," I began, keeping my eyes downcast, "the plan calls for granite. The stone being used is the local sandstone." He barely glanced at the paper, his eyes narrowing on me instead. "The quarry is too far. The governor wants this building finished before the wet season," he said, his voice low and dismissive. "You are here to draw what is being built, convict, not to question it. You will draw a strong, solid foundation, exactly as it appears in these plans. Is that understood?" His meaning was perfectly clear. I was to create a fiction, a reassuring picture for his superiors. That night, I could not sleep. I lay on my thin pallet, the sounds of the settlement fading into a low murmur, and wrestled with the choice before me. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at me to obey. A return to the labor gang, or worse, a flogging, was a terrifyingly real possibility. The memory of the endless, aching hunger I had felt just a few weeks prior was still sharp in my mind. Disobeying a direct order was madness. On the other hand, my whole life had been about the truth of a line, the honesty of a well-drawn plan. To knowingly draw a lie that might lead to a collapse felt like a betrayal of the only part of myself I had left. It was the same corrupt authority I had once printed pamphlets against, only now I was being asked to be its instrument. As the first light began to filter through the cracks in the hut, a new idea began to form, a path that was neither direct defiance nor complete surrender. It was a draftsman's solution, one born of detail and precision. I could draw the foundation exactly as the overseer demanded, with strong, confident lines that suggested immense strength and stability. The drawing itself would be a lie, satisfying his demand for a comforting report. However, in the annotation block, the small, detailed section of the plan where materials and measurements were formally listed, I would tell the truth in the most technical, neutral language possible. I would not write weak sandstone, but rather foundation course, locally quarried yellow sandstone. I would not note poor mortar, but mortar composition, 1 part lime to 6 parts river sand. This approach required all my skill. I spent the next 2 days working on the drawing, my hand steady as I rendered the flawed stones as if they were perfect blocks of granite. The cross-hatching to indicate texture, the shading to show depth. It was some of the finest work I had ever done. It felt dishonest, and a part of my soul recoiled from the act, but it was the only way I could see to protect myself while planting a seed of truth. The technical notes were written in my smallest, most precise script,
objective facts that no one could argue with. They were not an accusation, they were a record. If the building were ever to fail and an inquiry was held, my drawing would condemn the overseer, not me. I had simply documented what was there. When I presented the finished plan to the overseer, he unrolled it on his desk with a grunt of satisfaction. His eyes scanned the main drawing, the picture of a powerful, well-built foundation. He nodded, pleased with the illusion of strength I had created for him. "Good work," he mumbled, his finger tracing one of the bold lines. "This will look excellent in the governor's report." He never even glanced at the block of tiny, precise text in the corner, the part that contained the quiet, dangerous truth of the matter. He rolled the paper up and dismissed me with a wave, completely oblivious to the compromise I had made. Walking away from his office, I did not feel victorious. I felt a cold, hollow space in my chest. I had navigated the immediate danger and found a way to survive his order without completely abandoning my principles, but it felt like a tainted victory. I was learning a new skill, one not of drawing lines on paper, but of drawing lines in the shifting sands of power and survival in this colony. It was a bitter lesson, understanding that sometimes the only way to hold on to a piece of the truth was to wrap it carefully inside a well-constructed lie. It required a type of cunning I had never before needed. As I returned to my stool under the awning, the familiar sounds of construction seemed different now. The chipping of the hammers no longer sounded productive. It sounded like a slow, steady count toward an inevitable failure. I picked up a fresh piece of charcoal, my fingers feeling the familiar dusty texture. My task was done, for now, but the knowledge of what lay beneath that rising wall would remain with me. My understanding of what my craft could be used for, to reveal truth, to create beauty, or to conceal a perilous flaw, had been reshaped by the harsh realities of this new world. The guilt from the barracks drawing lingered in my mind, a subtle weight like a damp blanket. I had kept myself safe, yes, but the deceit felt like a stain, one that even the coarse lye soap we used could not scrub away. My days were a return to a familiar routine of assisting the surveyors, but my nights were filled with the memory of those false lines on the plan. This uneasy peace was broken by the cry of a lookout from the signal station. A ship had been sighted, a tall masted vessel making its way towards the harbor. Its arrival sent a ripple of mixed excitement and anxiety through the settlement. A ship meant news from home, fresh supplies, and perhaps new tools. But it also meant more hungry mouths to feed in a colony that always seemed to be one poor harvest away from starvation. This new vessel brought with it a different kind of man. He was the ship's surgeon, a fellow with a sharp, inquisitive gaze and hands that were surprisingly clean for someone who had just spent months at sea. I saw him walking the perimeter of the settlement, his brow furrowed as he looked not at the buildings or the fields, but at the scrubby, unfamiliar bush that crowded in on us. He carried a small leather-bound book, and I watched as he occasionally stopped to pinch a leaf from a plant, crush it between his fingers, and bring it to his nose. It was clear he was a man searching for answers in a landscape that, to most of us, offered only questions and hardship. His frustration was a common topic among the officers he spoke with. His ship's medical chests were running low on essentials like Peruvian bark, the source of quinine for treating fevers, and he was desperately seeking local substitutes. His search put an idea into my head, a seed of a plan that felt cleaner and more honest than my recent work on the barracks foundation. I thought of the old farmer, the man who had first shown me that my skill with a pencil could have practical value. His knowledge was of the earth, of what grew and what it was good for. My skill was in capturing the precise shape and form of things, giving them order on a page. I realized that his knowledge and my skill, when combined, might be worth something to a man like that surgeon. It was a long shot, a trade of information for goods in a place where a strong back was valued far more than a clever hand. But the thought of creating something useful and true was a powerful lure. The memory of the farmer pointing out the soothing properties of that first plant I sketched returned to me, a reminder that knowledge was a currency all its own. I sought him out that evening near the communal fires, where the day's fatigue settled over the convicts. The smoke stung my eyes slightly as I approached, and the murmur of conversation was a low, constant hum. I found him carving a piece of wood, his gnarled fingers surprisingly nimble. I explained my idea quietly, so others couldn't overhear. He listened without expression, his eyes fixed on his work. When I finished, he grunted. "You think a drawing of a weed is worth a twist of tobacco?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his rough voice. "He's a doctor, not a collector of pretty pictures." For a moment, my confidence wavered. But then I pressed on, explaining that the precision of a draftsman's drawing, paired with his knowledge of the plant's use, would be a form of scientific record, something a man of medicine would understand and value. He finally looked up, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Well," he said, "I suppose it's better than digging stumps." Our work began the very next day, during the brief moments of rest we were allowed. The farmer would lead me to a specific plant, perhaps a scraggly bush with waxy leaves, or a low-growing vine with tiny star-shaped flowers. He would tell me its properties as he understood them. This one for brewing a bitter tea to calm the stomach, that one for making a poultice to draw out infection from a wound. He had a deep, practical wisdom, though he admitted much of it was learned from watching the local Eora people from a distance. Historical accounts from this time often debate how much of this botanical knowledge was a genuine exchange and how much was simply observed by the colonists, a one-sided transfer that rarely acknowledged its source. While he explained, I would set to work with a piece of charcoal on a flattened sheet of bark, my drawing surface of choice. The process filled our small shared hut with a collection of new sensations. The air inside, usually smelling only of sweat and damp wool, now carried the sharp, clean scent of crushed eucalyptus and the earthy aroma of dug-up roots. My fingers, accustomed to the smooth hardness of charcoal, learned the different textures of the plants themselves. Some leaves were slick and waxy, resisting the damp. Others were covered in a fine, soft fuzz that felt like velvet. One afternoon, the farmer pointed out a bush with small, dark berries. After crushing one to show me the deep purple juice, he popped another in his mouth. "Good tucker," he mumbled, using the common slang for food. I tried one myself. The taste was a burst of surprising sweetness, a moment of pure, simple pleasure in a life that contained so few of them. After we had catalogued nearly a dozen plants, each one drawn with the precision of an architectural plan, I felt ready. I bundled the bark sheets carefully and approached the surgeon's tent. He was a busy man, and I had to wait for him to finish tending to a marine with a badly infected hand. When he finally turned to me, his expression was weary. I presented my work without a grand speech, simply unrolling the bark sheets on his table. He leaned in, his tired eyes widening slightly as he saw the detail. He picked one up, a drawing of the flowering tea tree. "The men call this one the healer's bush," I explained, repeating the farmer's words. "A tea from its leaves helps with coughs, and the crushed leaves themselves, when applied to a cut, seem to keep the foulness from setting in." It was a simple observation, but it was grounded in what we had seen work. The quirky thing is, we had no idea of the science, only the result. Something that future generations would understand as antiseptic properties. The surgeon examined each drawing, his finger tracing the lines of the leaves and stems. He was a professional, recognizing the work of another. He looked from the bark to my calloused hands, a silent acknowledgement of the strange contradiction I represented. He didn't offer praise, but he did offer a trade. "What do you want for this?" he asked, his voice direct. I had rehearsed my answer. Not freedom, not money. I asked for a length of good fishing line, a new, thicker blanket to ward off the chill that crept in from the floor of the hut at night, and a small portion of tobacco for the old farmer. The surgeon nodded, a flicker of what might have been respect in his eyes. He disappeared into his tent and returned with the items, placing them on the table next to my drawings. The exchange was simple, a quiet transaction that felt more significant than any order I had ever received from an overseer. Carrying the blanket and the line back to my quarters felt like a victory. It was a different kind of success than finding the river ford or being assigned to the surveying party. Those were acts of survival, of proving my worth to the authorities who held my life in their hands. This was different. This was creation and commerce. I had made something of value from my own skill and my friend's knowledge, and I had traded it on my own terms for things that would make our lives genuinely better. That evening, the old farmer held the twist of tobacco in his palm as if it were a precious jewel, and the scent of it burning was a small token of our shared success. This quiet trade, a simple exchange of knowledge for comfort, had altered the foundation of my existence here in ways I was only just beginning to chart. The summons came on a day much like any other, with the familiar clang of a hammer on anvil echoing from the blacksmith's forge. My name was called, not with the usual bark of an overseer assigning a task, but with a clipped formality from a red-coated soldier I did not recognize. A knot of cold dread, a feeling I had not truly shaken in years, tightened in my stomach. Such unexpected calls rarely brought good news. I followed the soldier across the dusty parade ground of the settlement, my worn leather boots making little sound. We entered the governor's administrative building, a place I had only ever documented from the outside. Inside, the air was still, and the scent of beeswax used to polish the dark timber floorboards was a strange luxury that made my nose twitch. It was a smell from another life, a world of ordered rooms and quiet contemplation that I had long since been forced to forget. The junior officer I had once drawn a map for sat behind a large desk. He was older now, with lines of responsibility etched around his eyes. But he looked at me with the same calculating expression I remembered. He did not ask me to sit. Instead, he unrolled a formal-looking document, its edges sealed with a smear of red wax. As he began to read in a monotone voice, the words seemed to float past me, each one a small, unbelievable pebble dropped into the deep well of my years of servitude. He spoke of my diligent service, my useful skills, and then he said the phrase that made my heart stumble in my chest: ticket of leave. It was not a full pardon, he explained, but a form of conditional freedom. I could work for myself, earn my own keep, and live as a free man, provided I did not leave the district and presented myself for regular musters. He pushed the document across the polished surface of the desk. My hand trembled as I reached for it. Walking out of that building was like stepping onto solid ground after a lifetime at sea. My legs felt unsteady, as if they might give way. The familiar sounds of the settlement, the shouting of orders, the rhythmic thud of axes, the cries of gulls circling for scraps, suddenly seemed distant, part of a world to which I no longer fully belonged. I found a spot in the shade of a tall gum tree and leaned against its smooth, cool bark, taking a breath that felt like the first true breath I had taken in a decade. It did not catch in my throat with the familiar tightness of anxiety. The document was still in my hand, a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper. I ran my thumb over the governor's signature, feeling the raised impression of the pen. This single piece of paper, covered in elegant, looping script, was now the line that separated my past from whatever was to come. It was a fragile thing, easily torn or stained, yet it held the weight of a new life. My first thought was of the old farmer. I found him near the communal vegetable plots, his back bent as he patiently coaxed a row of struggling bean seedlings. When I showed him the ticket, he did not offer loud congratulations. Instead, he simply straightened up, wiped a hand on his trousers, and took the paper from me. He read it slowly, his lips moving silently, before handing it back with a quiet nod. His eyes, however, held a look of profound satisfaction. "Well now," he said, his voice as earthy and steady as the soil he worked. "Land is what you'll need. Not the best plots, mind you. They keep those for the officers and the free settlers. But there is land to the west of the creek. Look for where the wattle trees grow thickest. The soil is dark there and holds the water." His advice, born of a lifetime of reading the language of the earth, was a far greater gift than any formal pronouncement. It was practical, necessary, and freely given. Following his direction, I spent the next day walking the small parcel of land allotted to me. It was a rough, untamed piece of the country, sloping down to a shallow, rock-strewn creek. I pushed through coarse, scratchy bushes that snagged at my clothes and kicked at loose stones with my boot. The air hummed with the sound of insects I still could not name, and every so often the loud, laughing call of a kookaburra would break the quiet. This was not the gentle, rolling green of England. It was a place of sharp edges and muted colors. Yet
As I stood on a small rise and looked out over the scattered eucalyptus trees, a feeling of ownership, fierce and deep, took root in me. I knelt down and scooped up a handful of the dark, crumbly soil. It felt cool and slightly damp against my palm. This wasn't the king's land or the governor's project. It was mine. I sat on a sun-warmed slab of sandstone and looked down at my own hands. I remembered them as they once were in London, pale, slender, stained with the clean black of India ink. They had been instruments of precision, capable of rendering the most delicate architectural detail. Now they were someone else's hands entirely. The palms were thick with calluses from the handles of axes and shovels. A long silvery scar ran across my left thumb, a memory from a slip with a wood-splitting wedge. The nails were short and permanently rimmed with dirt. These were the hands of a survivor, a laborer, a man who had been broken down and rebuilt by this hard country. And for the first time, looking at the rough, scarred skin, I felt not loss, but a quiet sort of pride. These hands had held me fast to life. As I gazed across the gentle slope of the land, my mind began to do what it has always done. I saw lines and angles where others might only see rocks and trees. My draftsman's eye began to impose order on the wildness. A house could stand right here, on this rise, its doorway positioned to catch the first rays of the morning sun. A single large window could face east, framing the view of the creek below. The walls would be of rough-hewn timber from the very trees I would have to clear, and the foundation would be of the solid, plentiful stone that littered the hillside. A small porch, a hearth for cooking, a roof to keep out the rain. A simple, sturdy structure began to form in my imagination, a shelter I would not have to share with dozens of other men, a place of my own making. That evening, back in the small hut I was still permitted to use until I built my own, I reached into my meager bundle of possessions. Tucked away at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was my greatest treasure. A single, unblemished sheet of real paper, acquired through a trade of botanical drawings months ago. I had been saving it, though for what I never knew. Now I did. I carefully unrolled it on the small, uneven table. Its clean, smooth surface seemed to glow in the dim light of my tallow lamp. It was a blank space, a page with no orders, no demands, and no lies to conceal. It was a canvas for a beginning. The potential held within its 4 perfect corners felt immense, almost overwhelming after so many years of living within lines drawn by others. With a sharpened piece of charcoal, the very tool of my first small act of defiance on this continent, I touched the tip to the paper. The small, gritty sound it made was immensely satisfying. I did not hesitate. The lines flowed from my hand, guided by a certainty that came from both years of training and years of hardship. First, the simple rectangle of the foundation, its dimensions carefully considered for stability and economy of materials. Then, the placement of the door, the window, the hearth. It was not a drawing of a grand London terrace or a commission for a colonial governor. It was the humble plan for a one-room house, a shelter against the wilderness. Yet, as I worked, I knew it was the most important drawing I had ever made. Each line was a declaration. This line was a wall to keep me safe. This one, a roof to keep me dry. This one, a window to let in the light. I was not just drawing a building, I was drawing a future. Looking down at the finished sketch, a simple but clear plan laid out on the pristine paper, I felt a calm settle over me. Outside, the strange night sounds of the bush began to rise, but they were no longer a source of fear. They were simply the sounds of my new home. This quiet act of creation, of planning a life on my own terms, was a feeling that stayed with me, a foundational line upon which everything else would be built. Our voyage through the stories of England's prisoners now finds its quiet anchorage for the night. We've sailed alongside them on their long passage south, listening to the ceaseless murmur of the waves against the hull, and watching unfamiliar constellations wheel across a dark sky. For them, the sight of a distant, ochre-hued coastline marked the end of a profound and arduous chapter. Just as their journey across the ocean found its end, let your own day draw to its gentle conclusion. The future they would build was still unknown, but it would be forged by their own hands, one sunrise at a time. May that same quiet sense of passage carry you toward slumber. Let go of the day's wake and allow yourself to drift into the deep calm of rest. Sleep well and awaken to the promise of your own new morning. Good night.